I'm Linda Chavez. Welcome to Free to Choose. Joining Dr. Friedman in a discussion of the power of the market are David Brookse of the Wall Street Journal and James Galbraith of the University of Texas at Austin. Dr. Galbraith, should we follow the example of Hong Kong and simply allow an unregulated free market?
I think we do better in this country with the combination of a free market and its advantages and a well-regulated, carefully thought-out structure of government, which provides a chance to pick up some of the losers from the market process and give them a second start, provides us with a chance to make the economic process a little safer, a little healthier, a little more environmentally sound and protective than you might get from a strict adherence to the free market such as Professor Friedman has described in the case of Hong Kong.
Dr. Friedman, is there any such thing as a well-regulated market?
No. He's begging the question. Obviously, he's right. If you could have a well-regulated, carefully thought-out, properly done market, benevolent dictatorship is the best of all forms of government.
Oh, I don't agree with that at all.
Neither do I.
Constitutional democracy is the best of all forms of government.
No, constitutional democracy is the least bad of all forms of government. But you beg all the questions when you talk about well-regulated, carefully thought out. If you look at the actual programs that government follows, they almost always have effects that are the opposite of those that were intended by their well-meaning advocates.
Let me tell you what troubles me.
I'll tell you something. Matching the invisible hand of government is the invisible hand of the market is the invisible foot of government.
You make the point in the program that in every case where you have a smaller role of government, a freer market, you have a higher standard of living. The same
no,
point.
I didn't say that.
At the same
I didn't say that. I said you have better conditions for the poorer people.
Better conditions. Okay, better conditions for the poor people. Fine, I'll accept that. At the same time, you're making the argument in the program that the conditions in Hong Kong are better, for example, than they are in the United States, which is manifestly not true. I mean, we do have. You are making the argument. You're making the argument that Hong Kong is more free than we are.
It is more free.
Does it then follow that the conditions for poor people in Hong Kong are better than they are in the United States?
We have to.
That I don't believe to be
I said
true.
in there where you compare like with like.
Well, now, okay. Well, this is an important qualification, which isn't
because
clear in
Hong
the program.
Kong, obviously, started out from a much lower position. If I were to compare Hong Kong conditions in Hong Kong in 1945 or 1950 with conditions in the United States in 1820. 1830, you'd have a much closer comparison.
But are you then saying, a position which I would find much more congenial, that where you have a country which has developed a base of material wealth, a degree of comfort for the average citizen, that it is then legitimate for the government of that country to step in and provide some guarantees and some security for poor people and old people and sick people?
I'm not saying that at all.
But why not? I mean, what's
because
wrong with that as a
Because every time they step in
position?
to try to do that, they end up doing the opposite.
Well, this discussion takes up or reflects a feature of the program that I found to be most troubling, which is a failure to make a distinction between governments of the kind that we have developed in this country over 200 years, and governments of the kind that you described in the People's Republic of China. It's perfectly clear that one can have, and many countries do have, the curse of repressive dictatorships. It's also perfectly clear that an economy that's organized by commissars is going to fail, and we certainly have seen laid out before us over the last several years the ashes of those failed economies. But is it possible to take the example of the Soviet Union, of Poland, of Hungary, and to say because their governments, which were after all dictatorships modeled after the system of government installed in the Soviet Union by Stalin, are in fact parallel to the actions of our government, which is a government which operates on many different federal levels, and where fundamentally what you have is the ability of the ordinary citizen whose power is not weighted by the amount of money he has or she has to use the vote in order to make some collective decisions. Now,
There are 3,400
after
pages in
10
the
years,
Clean Air Act. Where's the citizen in there?
Granted, after 10 years of Reagan's Washington, you've got a problem a serious problem of corruption in our democratic system. Does that mean that we should abandon the idea that you have a democratic process that should be entrusted with certain important decisions? I don't think so.
You don't have a democratic process in the sense in which you mean it. We have a democracy. We have a majority rule. But the majority that rules is a collection of minorities. It's a collection of special interests. You cannot tell me that the consumers of this country would vote for a sugar quota that makes the price of sugar 3 times the world price. When you say you can't compare it to Russia, you're quite right, but only because they are 100% and we're 50%. If our system, if our present regulations and rules had prevailed, if our scope of government had prevailed 100 years ago, we wouldn't be where we are today.
Let me understand you, Dr. Friedman. Do you believe that there should be no role at all whatsoever for government?
Of course there should be a role for government. There's
What
a
is
very
that role?
important role for government. The role for government is, first of all, to protect people from coercion physical coercion by their neighbors or by foreign countries. It is to protect the national defense and to protect law and order at home. There's a role for government in enabling us to have a mechanism whereby we decide on the rules by which we want to run, how we define private property, what we mean by private property. There's a role for government in adjudicating disputes between us. There is a role for government, a very important role. And I believe our government played that role quite well for about 100 years, until the Great Depression.
I'd go a little further. I think there is a health and safety role as well. The problem is you have to keep your regulations simple and minimal. You have to realize that there are costs, and often the costs outweigh the benefits. In fact, in Washington, there are interests who want to divert costs to themselves. So there's sort of a built-in structure, a dynamic, to make costs outweigh the benefits.
Well, we're making progress here. I would add that there's a role, the government has a role to protect the environment. I would say the government has a role to set standards for products in areas where information is very costly for the individual consumer to obtain. I like very much the fact that the steaks that dentist was eating were inspected by the USDA. Their purity was guaranteed by a rather well-functioning aspect of our government. Go ahead.
On the other hand, you've got the FDA, which has these long delays, 10 years to get a drug approved. So the effect is that you have to be a big drug company to get any kind of, to enter the market, and you basically are closing off the market.
On the other hand, you've had a set of regulations which have disappeared without any well-justified regrets. For example, the regulations that govern the entry into interstate trucking, the regulations that govern entry and rates in
and
airlines.
Incidentally, that was done under the Reagan administration.
No. Those reforms were done under the Carter administration.
They were started under the Carter administration.
They were, and
completed under the Reagan.
Oh, they were not. They were stalled under the Reagan administration.
It doesn't really matter.
It doesn't really matter.
No, it does matter a great deal. The question of who favors these things and on what merits. But
there's no doubt that Carter did the heavy lifting on deregulation.
Thank you.
But in any event, I'm not trying to defend one political party or another. As David says, a major enemy of a free market is a business interest. The business community is a major enemy. And the problem in the society is to have the public at large understand the importance of free markets so as to protect themselves against the depredations of the business community with their tariffs, their quotas, their special provisions, and so on. But if you come to all of these good things that society is supposed to do, you have to look at how many of them have been perverse in their influences and their effect. You mentioned the FDA, and that's a very important case because that's caused tens of thousands of lives over the course of time because of the evidence has been. Go ahead.
I mean, you can start with the AIDS virus, where the FDA tries again. Recently, there have been reforms, but they were very slow to let people, even people who knew they were going to die and were going to die without any drug, to try experimental drugs.
Let me ask another question.
You'd have to establish that those experimental drugs would have, in fact, saved their lives.
They couldn't have done worse. They were going to die.
Let me give you another hypothetical. What if you have a social need, say a disease which is very lethal but affects very few people, and you don't have a company who has an interest because it's not going to make very much money, there's not a large market for the good, to produce a drug? Does the government have any role there to step in to try and stimulate certain social purposes?
It's hard for me to imagine. I can't imagine how the government would in the first place.
But in any event, you must realize that government isn't the only recourse.
Yeah.
The great period, when were the nonprofit hospitals of the United States founded? Almost all of them were in the 19th century during the heyday of laissez-faire. There are private charitable activities, which are essentially the most effective way of handling the kind of things you've described.
Yeah. Right.
A little bit of faithfulness to history surely would cause you to concede that in 1937, when we inaugurated Social Security, in 1965, when we inaugurated Medicare, we did so because the private charitable systems, the private insurance systems to care for people when they were old and when they were sick were failing in a gross way to meet the needs of the American people. And those programs, which are government programs, have at least had the virtue of extending the access to health care and extending income security when you're old to a very, very large part of the population that never had it before. And I would argue, too, that in addition to the regulatory functions and the judicial functions that we certainly agree on, that there is in a rich society which can afford to take care of people who fall out of the market process, who aren't lucky or gifted or fortunate in their economic lives, to take care of those people when they are old and when they're sick.
But what about the extent to which the same society that you describe, the same logic that you describe, makes them poor? What about the minimum wage, which prevents many people from getting employment? What about the rent controls which destroy housing in the cities? And you're trying to look at
I'm beginning to switch over. You can point to the minimum wage, which everybody agrees increases unemployment among the poor, especially. But what about the environment? I mean, if you have if you have a simple environmental law, I mean, the reason the West is cleaner than the East, the Eastern Bloc, is the main reason is we're richer. We can afford to do it.
The problem, so far as the environment is concerned, the real function of the government is to define the property rights. And it is quite clear that if I force you to take bad water for good water, well, then I ought to pay you. I'm not quarreling with that. But if you look at the actual environmental measures that government takes, they often have harmful effects and not positive effects. The new clean air bill that has just been passed, for example, is going to cost an enormous amount of money.
Well, nobody knows how much.
In principle, of course, your argument is one which many economists are sympathetic to, and I have some sympathy for it. But the technical facts of environmental control are such that it is often very, very costly to define the property rights in a way in which you can generate an efficiently functioning market. That is why you don't have a privately organized market. The information cost of those transactions is extremely high. So in some cases, what you want to have the government do is say, if there is mercury in the water, you find out who's putting it in and you shut them down.
But let's look at what the government...
That's a reasonable way to proceed because the alternative is extremely costly.
But let's look at what the government actually does. In the United States today, the federal government spends an amount of money which is 25% of the national income. State and local governments spend an additional 17% of the national income. That's 42% altogether. Now, some of that is doing good, of course. It'd be very hard to spend that amount of money. But an enormous amount of that is simply taking money from some and giving it to others, and very often taking it from poor and giving it to well-to-do.
Now, you're counting, of course, Social Security in that, which is taking money from the payroll tax from working people and transferring it to the old.
On the whole, so far as Social Security is concerned, the people who pay are poorer than the people who benefit.
Gentlemen, we are out of time. Thank you for watching Free to Choose. Next week, we'll be discussing what happens when government enters the marketplace.